Okay, so after UFC 298, Dana White went onto his Instagram and finally announced the UFC 300 main event. And there have been some fans out there that are still disappointed by what's going on. And I'm going to explain why in this video, why fans might be feeling that way, and just overall how good UFC 300 actually is. But I think what we're going to have to break down here is the fans' reaction to UFC 300 is not because UFC 300 is a bad card. It is because what they were promising us, or the way that the UFC hyped up UFC 300, made fans' expectations just so much that I don't think it could realistically live up to it. Maybe they could have done a few things, we'll talk about that, but they just hyped it up so much for so long, and then once they delivered it, it's good. But fans were expecting something with just a little bit more punch, which might be a bit unfair as we look at UFC 300 and talk about it a little bit more. Now, where to begin with this? I think the right way to begin with this, and the blame to lay here, goes right at Dana White's feet. Dana White is the promoter of the UFC, the president, but he does the job of the promoter. And he has been speaking about UFC 300 for about 6 months, talking about how from the first fight onwards, it's just going to blow your mind away. It was originally thought that Bo Nickel was going to be the opening fight, but ever since then, he's probably listened to the fans' reaction, and it's now going to be Deiveson Figueiredo versus bloody Cody Garbrandt. Deiveson Figueiredo versus Cody Garbrandt, and then the card is going to build from there. I think what is hurting UFC so much, and what is hurting the announcement of UFC 300 so much, is all the hype that went into it, and the fact that we sort of know that they were struggling to put together that main event, that last fight that it really needed. You know, we heard from Jon Jones that they were calling him last minute. I mean, we've heard from from Jamahal Hill that he literally only found out that he was going to be on UFC 300 the day before that Dana told it to us. Conor McGregor is out there. Conor McGregor is begging the UFC for a fight. Dana White is saying that it's Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor is the one that's holding up him not getting back into the octagon. Nate Diaz wanted to come back to UFC 300. We're not getting Nate Diaz. The fans were just expecting something big to go off at UFC 300. And what we've got is a lot of small, great things that if they were just announced to us without any of the overhyping coming from Dana White, fans would be blown away by UFC 300. But the problem is that Dana White told us for 6 months that 300 was going to be the greatest thing you ever saw. And fans' expectations were built up to that, plus all the rumors that the UFC were sort of allowing to go out there and allowing to percolate. You know, Dana White slow burnt us, the fans, by giving us little drips of the fights and wanted us to speculate about what was going to happen next. The problem is when you can't deliver on that speculation, it's very easy to make the fans feel disappointed. Now, there are a lot of people out there saying that fans were expecting too much from UFC 300. You know, they wanted to see Godzilla versus Jesus in the cage, or Dana White versus Zuckerberg, or something just insane. And while there is a little bit of that, I do think that that is a bit unfair. When you go back and look at UFC 200, and a USADA exemption was made for Brock Lesnar. Now, why that same USADA exemption wasn't allowed for Jon Jones is, I don't know why. Maybe because they were planning on keeping Jon Jones in the UFC and it would have just spoiled everything to allow him to go ahead and fight with drugs in his system at UFC 200. But with Brock Lesnar, it was a sort of one-off. He was going to go back to the WWE. So to allow him to fight with drugs in his system, the UFC could have been like, oh, wow, that was a weird thing that happened. That's never going to happen again. Maybe that's what they were hiding behind. But the fact is, Brock Lesnar came back and fought on UFC 200. An exemption was made for him. So we have a precedent for something special happening for these century cards, for this 100, 200, 300. We have a precedent of something special being allowed. And you have these names out there that are just as special as Brock Lesnar, if not more special than Brock Lesnar, being floated around and being talked about in the lead up to 300. Again, you have Diaz, you have McGregor. I know that now GSP has come out and said he will never fight MMA again. But before he did that, there was talk about GSP as well. There was just a lot of speculation that UFC 300 was going to give us something that had a little bit different to it, a bit more of an event to it. And what we got in place of that was the BMF belt. Now, the BMF belt is a gimmick produced by the UFC, well, produced by Nate Diaz, but marketed by the UFC. That's meant to be this fun little bit of flavor, something a little bit different. But it just doesn't hit with the fans the way that a Nate Diaz comeback or the way that a Brock Lesnar comeback does. It's an artificial sort of flavor. It's not. It doesn't generate the kind of hype that the UFC think it does. Justin Gaethje versus Max Holloway is a fun fight for the fans, but there's no need to have the BMF belt there. There's no need for the BMF belt to exist at all. So I think the UFC heard or knew that the fans expected something a little bit fun, a little bit different, and gave us the BMF belt to satisfy that urge, and I don't think it landed the way they expected it to. Now they're left with, well, we need a main event. And again, speculation is being driven about what is this main event going to be. Is it going to be Alex Pereira versus Tom Aspinall? Is it going to be Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler? Dana White said there is this super fight that just fell into his lap. Is it going to be this super fight? Is now the time, UFC 300, to do Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz 3? And then we come out to realize that Conor McGregor is having contract negotiations with the UFC. And there is this rumor going around that Nate Diaz is never going to fight the UFC again, to send a message going forward to other fighters that you do not leave our company, go box, and then come back. So Nate Diaz is wiped off the slate. There is just so much going on of what is it going to be. John Jones releases his news that he is getting asked last minute what it's going to be. Dana White does yet another interview saying that there could be a documentary released about this and that UFC 300 could change completely from what we know already. There is just so much speculation and drive going into what the main announcement is going to be, what the main event is going to be, that what we get is a really good fight. A really, really good fight. You know, Jamahal Hill versus Alex Pereira is a great fight. It really is. But you take all of that expectation, and then put it on just that really good fight. And it just falls a little bit flat. And that's not the fans' fault. That's the UFC's fault for allowing all of that nonsense and noise to happen and to promise and to promise and to promise and then give us a really good fight. There's a disconnect there. And that's all right. But now that that's happened, it's time to move on from that. Because when you do look at just UFC 300 and what we have got, it's a phenomenal card. It is a phenomenal card. There should be no more trash talking of UFC 300. It is a great card. And then not only is UFC 300 a great card, but 298 was a fun card and had great matchups going into it before we saw them. Like, we were amped for 298. 299 is a great card, and we're amped for 299. 300 is a great card. Not only are we getting a great UFC 300, we're getting 3 great pay-per-views in a row. That's amazing. It is such a good time to be a UFC fan. So perhaps if they had just announced UFC 300 the way that they usually announce like a regular pay-per-view card, we would be so amped for UFC 300. We would be so excited for it because we, the community, would be building the hype for it rather than the UFC telling us to get hyped for this crazy thing that it's going to be God versus the devil in a UFC cage and then giving us a really good card, which is what we should have expected. But they told us to expect unrivaled greatness. I think that's the tagline for UFC 300. And, you know, perhaps UFC 300 is unrivaled great. I can't think of a better UFC card that we've ever gotten than UFC 300. I think the second thing that leads to the disappointment here of UFC 300 is the way that the main event was announced to us. We had this slow drip feed of the entire card, and there was so much excitement for the main event that it sort of felt like, are we going to get like a trailer? Are we going to get So the people were speculating, and I don't think there was any merit in it, but people were speculating that it might get announced during the Super Bowl. That's ridiculous. The UFC would never spend that much money. But that's the thing. There was so much expectation out there. Personally, I believed that we were going to get some cool countdown-esque trailer, some cool extended trailer during the pay-per-view of UFC 298. I thought we were going to have a cool trailer. Like when we heard that Brock Lesnar was coming back for UFC 200, I remember watching that moment at a pub. We got a trailer for that just before the main event. And I thought we were going to get something similar to that at UFC 298. Just before the main event, before Ilia Topuria walks, we were going to get some sort of awesome trailer. But whatever was going on with UFC 300 was so last minute that Dana had to make it going into UFC 298. He promised us that he would tell us who the main event was going to be by the end of UFC 298. And I honestly believe that during the weigh-ins on Friday, Dana was still trying to figure out what the hell he was going to do as a main event for UFC 300. And then they didn't have time to prepare some sort of great announcement. And it was just Dana White dropping a clip on his Instagram. Again, UFC 300 is this milestone. It's this thing that's capping off 30 years of MMA. And we get our main event announcement as just Dana White talking to a camera, talking head video. It just falls a little flat, but that's fine. It's all behind us now. The hype is behind us. Focus on the card that we've got. The card that we've got is absolutely phenomenal. Phenomenal. It would be hard to make a better fight than that, right? I mean, main event is going to be a banger of a fight. And it's let's be honest, it is way better than Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad as UFC 300 main event. And it was looking like that might be the only fight that we had left. They pretty much sacrificed the main event of the Brazil card to give us this card. So I think we should appreciate that because Leon's ready to go. Belal's ready to go. No one wants to see that fight. That fight is put it as a co-main event in England and let Tom Aspinall main event, right? That's where that card, it's just one of those fights that needs to happen. So let's just get it done and put a better fight on top of it. That's not 300. That is not 300 main event level. So they at least gave us something that is really good. Right, then after that, you got Weili versus Yang Xiaonan. Look, UFC is partnered with Disney. ESPN is the main distributor. It owns the license to all of the UFC product that we see. They're under contract. We have to watch it through through Disney. So obviously, we're going to get a fight like this. We're going to get a WMMA fight on the main card. And could they have put on a better women's MMA fight? Out of all the women that we have in the UFC, could they have put on a better one on the main card? I don't think so. And we had to get one on the main card, and they've only given us one on the main card, and they've given us the best one that they can. So, you know, Dana White does his best for us, the fans. He lets Sean Strickland say whatever he wants. He lets Manel Kape say whatever he wants. He walks Trump down into the arena when the entire world is always anti-Trump. But he can't not put on a WMMA fight on UFC 300. So he's given us the best one that we can. Again, we should be happy with what we've gotten here. We got Holloway Gaethje, great fight. Great fight. We got Aljo Qatar, great fight. Great fight. We got Sarukian versus Oliveira, amazing fight. All of those fights right there could headline a UFC pay-per-view, could headline a UFC fight night, just in the main card alone. It's brilliant. Yuri Prohaska versus Rakic, great. Yuri Prohaska is a former champion. That is a fight night main event, right? You got Bobby Green versus Miller. That one is for the fans. That's great. Andrade versus Rodriguez, whatever, who cares? Bo Nickel, good. We get to see him beat up someone else. This fight that people are talking about, that I want to talk about, Holly Holm versus Kayla Harrison. Don't worry about it. It's not going to happen. That fight is not going to go through. Kayla Harrison is not going to make 135 pounds. That fight's going to get called off because Kayla Harrison can't make weight. I guarantee that fight is not going to happen. There's no way it can. Lopez versus Yusuf, awesome fight, banger of a fight. And then again, to open the main event, you got Garbrandt versus Figueiredo. That is a sick card after UFC 299. That is amazing. So if you are still upset and still trash talking UFC 300, you're just being a bit of a spoilt child. Like, it's really good. The way that the UFC hyped it up kind of sunk its hype. If they had just dropped this, we would be going nuts over this card. So let's look forward to it and enjoy it. And, you know, when you see someone still trashing it, it's understandable because of what we got promised, but it's time to move on from that. Stop being a child. What we have is really good, really good. Let me know about UFC 300. Which fight are you the most excited about, right? Put that down there in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Every single sub means so much to small creators like myself. And of course, I will see you all in the next video.